Good morning, everybody. We're not starting just yet, but just wanted people to know that we will be starting momentarily, just to be mindful of everybody's time on a Saturday morning. If anybody does have questions, we do have volunteers here. I see Kim back there holding up a box. Please write down any questions that you have, and we will be taking questions and giving answers at the end of this session. And again, we'll be around if you guys hear something from one of our presenters that makes you think, oh, I want to ask about that. So we'll be around with a box. Yeah, look for Kim. That this is okay. Now it's live. All right, friends, we are going to get started. If people could go ahead and take their seats. I don't know who that is. Is there one more chair? So we'll just grab one over there. All right. Good morning / almost good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here today. We want to thank everyone for taking time out of your Saturday morning to attend this community conversation on public education funding. This event is organized by your local chapter of Isaiah, Minnesota. Isaiah is a multiracial, statewide, nonpartisan coalition of faith communities that advocate for racial and economic justice in Minnesota. The committee that specifically organized this event is made up of parents like me who have children who are in the Rochester Public Schools, educators who are part of this district, and other community members who know that children are our future and that we need to solidify their path. The state of Minnesota has a historic surplus, and our governor, House Speaker, and Senate leader have set a budget target of $2.21 billion for K-12 education. That is an incredible and a historic amount of money. But this is also after decades of underfunding by the state for our public schools. So what does this infusion of funds mean 5 years from now? Well, what does it mean 5 weeks from now? What does it mean 5 years from now? What does it mean 10 years from now? We're not going to get those answers today, but we are grateful to have this panel of speakers available to educate us on the nuances of public school funding and some of the victories and challenges that are faced by our students and our educators. We will also be joined by Senator Liz Bolden and Representative Kim Hicks to give us a further glimpse of what is happening on the state level for future funding. And finally, we are going to conclude this session with questions from the audience. As I had stated earlier, we do have, Kim is around and back there. She is gathering questions from the audience on index cards. So if you guys hear something that you want to comment on or have an extra question on, please find Kim and we will make sure to get that question written down and answered and delivered up here. So again, thank you guys so much for attending today, taking time out of your morning. And I'm gonna turn it over to Senator. I just elevated you, sir. Okay, Superintendent, you're up. Okay, I'm sorry, I had way too much coffee this morning, so Superintendent Piquel, please, thank you. We gave him the power and then we took the mic. Oh, there you go. Thank you, Pastor Kirkland. All right, well, I'll go ahead and pass. I'll share. See, look at me with my sharing. There you go.
So I want to thank all of you for coming. My name's Kent Piquel. I have the honor of being superintendent. I'm here. Don't be scared by the computer on my lap. I was asked to give a primer on school finance, and I think in the interest of not having you all run screaming from this room on a Saturday morning, it is going to be very, very brief. But I did bring this so I could pull out just a few numbers. I'm happy to say that a far more powerful computer just walked in the room in the brain of our Chief Administrative Officer, John Carlson, who is up there, and will be able to give us a Hail Mary if we need it, if I need a lifeline. And then I do want to kind of share just a few conceptual points, and then I'm really excited to hear from these colleagues. In the state of Minnesota, unlike many, many other states, our funding largely comes from the state of Minnesota, which, if you know anything about American education, is radically different than in many other states where local property taxes are the primary driver of K-12, leading to dramatic differences when you move from one district to the other. In Boston, for instance, where I did my student teaching in an urban area, you go across a line to Lexington and you see gigantic differences in per student funding because in those states, local property taxes are the largest driver of K-12. In Minnesota in 1990, our state flipped the switch and took over that state funding. So to a certain extent, this discussion we're going to have here, that's why it's so exciting to have our legislators here, is about the state policy, though what we do with those dollars at the local level also matters tremendously. So really briefly, the big share of those dollars come from the state in what we call the general education program. That is our basic meat and potatoes funding for current operating expenses, salaries, curriculum, other resources. In most school districts, that, including ours, that's between 55 and 60% of the revenue. And that is pretty uniform across the state. And then there's actually about 12 what we call categorical funding streams. They're dollars that are intended for specific purposes. And those usually vary based on the demographics of your students. And so there's a state funding stream, for instance, for kids who live in poverty called compensatory education revenue. And that varies not only with how many of the kids that you have in your district who, up till now, it's measured by qualifying for free and reduced price lunch. That is about to change here and in many other places. There's also a concentration factor, and so the dollars are more based upon how many of those kids are in the school. And there are other categorical funding streams for things like services for students with disabilities, usually referred to as special education funding, multi-language learner services, or what the state calls English language learner services. And so those are targeted for specific purposes, whereas the general education formula is more flexible for providing the core supports for schools. So in Minnesota, in the 21-22 school year, the total funding, one final point. The state also controls the amount a local school district can levy of its own taxpayers. And so there is the authority also to levy locally, but we can't decide unilaterally in Rochester how much to make that. We have to abide by state guidelines, and in some instances go to the voters to ask them to approve local taxes for education. So across the state as a whole, in 21-22 school year, total revenue was $16.614 billion with a B. About $10 billion of that was in state aid directly in that general fund bucket and those other categoricals. $4.1 billion, actually about $4.2 billion, was from local property taxes that the state authorizes the school districts to ask their voters to support. Well, not really ask, to require them to support. And then $2.4 billion is from federal funds. So the federal funding for education is actually quite small if you look at it as a size, though it's very targeted in certain areas. So in Rochester Public Schools, for the current school year, our state funding makes up 75.5% of our resources. That's $190 million plus a little bit. 16.6% is from our local property taxes. That's $41,919,000. 5.9% for us is from the federal government, $14,815,000. And then there's other local revenues that are about 2%, and that's $4,982,000. So that's a rough breakdown of kind of where the money comes from. Let me just make kind of 4 sort of broad conceptual points, and then we'll turn it over to the discussion. Many times the discussions of school funding, especially when we're in a legislative session, especially when our leaders are on the verge of making some historic decisions, focuses on how we actually design the funding streams, how much we put in. We have to not forget that the other critical driver is enrollment, that the dollars follow the kids. And we have seen, not just in Rochester but around the country, a historic decline in K-12 enrollments generally. We actually are doing much, much better than most other urban systems in Minnesota and around the country. We have had about 600 student decline since 2019, which is the size of an elementary school in some cases, so it's not insignificant. It is not plummeting enrollment, and every once in a while I hear that, and I want to really be really clear about it. But our financial future depends first on being the provider of choice as the school district for Rochester families. And if we are not attracting those kids to our district, the dollars that I just talked about go wherever they are being educated, whether it's another school district, a private school, a homeschool option. So we got to remember enrollment is a huge piece of our finance picture. Second, a lot of discussions of school finance understandably focus on what we might call the input. How much are we spending for class size, or how many school days do we have, or many other things like that. That's really critical, but I think in the end what we all care about is our students' academic, social, and emotional outcomes. And so thinking about cost per educational outcome is trickier, but it's really important to remember. A lot of times a quote that gets said often is, your budgets are an expression of your values. And I think that is true. But ultimately, our values are most expressed by how our kids are doing, as opposed to just. So for instance, class size is certainly something that I was a high school teacher, and I had 189 kids at one time in my highest year with students. Class size matters a lot. We know from efforts to reduce class size around the country that if you do that, but you don't have sufficient well-prepared teachers to fill those additional positions, when you lower class size, you don't get gains in student learning. And so focusing only on the class size but not on the readiness of the teachers to take advantage of those smaller classes doesn't add up to the improved outcomes that we're trying to look at. So think about financial inputs tied to the educational outcomes we want for our students. Third point, we know that K-12, pre-K through 12, really, really matters. But kids in the United States between kindergarten and 12th grade spend 15% of their time in schools, 1-5. 85% is outside schools. And we know that the housing stability, the jobs, the health care that those families have also influences their kids' success. And so sometimes when legislators like the Rochester delegation have to make decisions about K-12, the other decisions that they make are also going to influence our students, even though they aren't strictly funding for education. Then a final point about where we are in Rochester. In our strategic plan, next year we will begin a very important redesign of the way we allocate funding in our district to our schools. That goes into the design phase next year and implementation beginning in the 24-25 school year. And that is when we are going to ask the hard questions about the ways we fund and staff our schools, and do they reflect the needs of the kids that are in our schools, and do they best support innovation and personalization of the educational process at that school level. And that's going to be a very, very important effort. There are flexible ways that we have the authority to allocate the money differently than we do today. And the reason we're beginning that process next year, not this year, is we want that to follow the work we're doing this year to define our academic agenda, to really understand the needs of our students. So in the next month, for instance, we'll be releasing a year-long independent review of our schools and the degree to which we really have the supports we need to have for students who are struggling academically or socially and emotionally. We want the findings of that kind of thinking to inform how we allocate our dollars in the district, rather than focusing first on the dollars and then hoping the educational piece flows out. So that's going to be a really important discussion, and the degree to which we have the resources that I think we all want for our kids is going to be very much determined by what happens at the legislature this spring. And so it's a really well-timed discussion, and thank you for holding it and inviting us.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Dr. Barnum, if you would please introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. I am Bridget Bordelon. I live here in Rochester, and my son will be entering Gage Spanish Immersion this fall, so I'm about to experience public education from the parent side this year. The first thing I would like to share with you is that I am literally doing my dream job. I am. I have always wanted to be a teacher. I am very committed to public education, and because of that, I want the best for the students I work with, the students in my building, and of course for my son as he works his way through public education. If I were to summarize for you the benefit of a fully funded K-12 education, it would be in one word, which is access. Access really summarizes what students will have with a fully funded public education. This includes things like, as a multi-language learner teacher, my students are new to country, and oftentimes the first generation to go through the process of applying for and enrolling in American college. So having access to assistance with that, to instruction with that, and to be able to go through and successfully apply to earn the degrees that they would like, that would be beneficial to them and their family and to the communities they live in. It would also mean adequate mental health care. ML students are not the only ones who come to us with social emotional needs, and for them to have access to mental health so they can develop resiliency, to be able to navigate as adults on their own and function as adults who are successful and well-rounded people. And finally, to have access to the best educational resources. That includes things like a full-time media specialist at all of the buildings. Media specialist is not my area, but I've had to kind of work to fill that gap because we haven't had a full-time position at our building. So having access to things like that, to some of the co-teaching models that we've been at, so students with different needs have a content expert and then a specialist in their classroom to really enable them to access content and to be successful. And then also access to our counselors. Every student has a counselor, and our counselors are overwhelmed with the number of students they have. And so with increased funding, we would be able to provide some of those supports so that counselors get the opportunity to know their students because they have a more reasonable caseload. So thank you for coming today. I look forward to any questions you might have that apply to what my role is, but public funding for education means access.
Thank you. All right, if you could, there you go. Next up, this is Sherry. Sherry is a student, and if you could just introduce yourself and tell our audience about yourself.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Sherry. I'm a senior at John Marshall High School, and yeah. As a student, I have student experiences, and a lot of it relates to what Dr. Pakel was saying about social emotional learning and Dr. Bordelon saying about access. But personally, I find my passion in fine arts programs and electives within public schools. Specifically, I'm talking about music, but this delves into other sorts of fine arts electives. Just the amount of workload that students have every single day and the struggles that everybody faces is insurmountable, and it's grown a lot within the past couple of years. Just the amount that students are experiencing in this day and age is honestly a little bit horrific, but just having access to the things that make life a lot better to live is more than life itself. So for example, I am a music student. I participate in my school's band, and you know, the classes are hard, life is hard, working, my busy schedule, it all adds up to a lot. But being able to let go and be able to immerse myself into music and into culture and into the community of my school is invaluable. And to be able to have access to this, so in my band program, we partner with this music school that's located based in the Twin Cities. It's called McPhail, and it allows our students to have access to private music lessons which they otherwise wouldn't be able to have, whether because it's by timing or it's by funding and budget personally. Yeah, so being able to take time out of the school day, the preset school day, to be able to learn more about this music, to be able to get past that first beginning steps of, you know, just the physical constraints of, you know, delving into music and delving into any sort of hobby, and be able to reach a higher plane of understanding and emotional depth, and just being able to be delved into that amazingness and that kind of finding a joy and a purpose in life, and creating passion and creativity and wanting to learn more in our students is something that we should be paying attention to. And so then with an increased funding and by increasing the capacity for fine arts and electives to be able to have more than just school, but to build students into people, into leaders who are passionate about the world around them and are willing to be able to be creative and divergent and contributing to communities around them. So thank you all for being here and listening to student perspectives that are strewn about this room.
Thank you. Sherry, thank you so much for sharing with us. And next up, we have Principal Matt Ruzak. Please introduce. No, that's yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. My name is Matt Ruzek. I am the fortunate principal of John Marshall High School. Go ahead. There you go. There you go. So this is my first year at John Marshall. I think it's my 24th or 5th year within our district, somewhere around there. I've had the really great fortune of being a principal in a number of different sites. Previous to my stay at JM, I was at Riverside Elementary School, which is an absolutely fantastic place. The last handful of years, we've made reductions of some sort. and listening to the folks who just spoke before me, the constant for a building administrator is trying to do more with less, and then also negotiating on things that you care deeply about and trying to put it on a scale. So when I hear Sherry reference fine arts and McPhail, it's a perfect example. We're looking for donations, we're looking for grants. I would say there's not a day that does not go by where we're trying to access some alternative funding to provide, in my eyes, the essential elements of school that are going to allow not just our students, but our staff to be successful. We're really incredibly fortunate at JM, and I see a number of JM, not only parents and students in here, but staff. Bridget's remarkable, and I can lean on her as a building administrator to do incredible things with second language learners, but I can only imagine what she could do if she were, and her program were fully funded. And I think the largest challenge for me is that we've had this for a number of years, and then we had giant disruption to what we know as public education. And I see this, I'm so tempted to drum on these drums, even though I'm not a drummer, but I just have to say that out loud. But I also see the guitar, and I think about it when we left, we were teaching our students, and I was teaching elementary students at the time as an administrator in an elementary building to play the guitar. When they came back, we handed them left-handed guitars, and they were all learning on right hands before they started. So we're in this really precarious position where we're not 100% certain what thing they need to have addressed and how much they need it to be addressed. So we're sifting through all of this with some of the same elements that were there before and trying to assess. I do think, in regards to Dr. Piquel, has proposed and put forth with a collection of individuals a plan that's allowing us to look at both qualitative and quantitative data that is forcing us to become more efficient. So as taxpayers, as community members, the idea and the numbers that Dr. Piquel referenced are big. I even saw a gaping mouth when the billions came out. But the fact of the matter is, I can say with certainty in the last year and a half, we are way more efficient and way more calculated in regards to evaluating what we need and then how do we fund it. And I think what we're starting to discover is we need more. And we have a plan now in place to put it in the appropriate locations, but we need that access to begin so that we can provide supports to all these programs. I'm really appreciative of the cards. I am a rambler, so thank you. She's showing us 30 seconds. So anyway, I look forward to your questions. I'm really grateful for you all for being here and anything we can do to provide clarity and guidance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, next up is Anne-Marie Griffin. So one of you guys gonna have to share with her.
Got it. So I'd like to start with a question to the audience. When you need information in your day, where do you go to find answers? What do you do? Do you look it up in a book, newspaper, a phone book? Do you search the internet? Do you ask someone? How long does it take you to find an answer? A minute? 5? 10? Longer? The skills that we use every day to find information have changed dramatically since I was a kid. Back then, we were taught how to use an encyclopedia, how to use a dictionary. We looked up phone numbers in the phone book. We used the newspaper to find out what movies were playing. Today, we live in a digital world, and the answer to every question can seemingly be found on the internet. Yet we all know, that much of what is on the internet is biased. It's out of date, it can be misleading, and oftentimes it's just not true. Parents legitimately wonder about identity theft, their kids hooking up with people that they meet on the internet, the risks of cyberbullying, and the negative impacts on students' mental health. Shouldn't somebody be guiding our students to be smart and safe online while they're on the internet? I am that somebody. My name's Anne-Marie Griffin, and I'm one of the 13 library media specialists in the Rochester Public Schools. Library media specialists are teachers and librarians. These days we're called media specialists, but I like to think of us as information specialists. We typically have a bachelor's degree in education and a master's degree in library science in order to qualify for licensure in the state of Minnesota. This license allows us to manage a school library and to teach information literacy skills to all of our students. The skills that we teach to our students still include learning how to use an encyclopedia, a dictionary, newspapers, but we also go above and beyond, and we teach the skills necessary for our students to become safe and confident explorers of the online world. So, a little bit of data for you. RPS has about 17,400 students. Divided equally among our media specialists, that would be 1,300 students per licensed media specialist. I wish that we were divided equally. I currently work at 2 schools. I teach about 800 students. I manage a collection of about 20,000 books and digital pieces for over 1,000 students. Now, other elementary media specialists are about the same. Sadly, for a number of years, we've had only two licensed media specialists at our 4 middle schools and 3 high schools. This is a shocking statistic, especially if you are the parent of a middle schooler or a high schooler. These 2 media specialists have been trying to meet the needs of almost 8,000 students. Students and staff rarely see their media specialist, and the behind-the-scenes work is getting done, but the task of taking care of millions of dollars worth of materials. In their limited time in their buildings, they are not able to teach students, to support staff, to offer the trainings that are needed. And now they've been cut completely. All Rochester students must be taught how to find, evaluate, and use information ethically in their schoolwork. This is especially true in our middle school and high schools. Teachers and students need the support of licensed school media specialists. They are specifically trained to teach these skills. Increased funding at the state would help RPS better staff these schools with critically important educators. We need more, though, than just a 2-year bump. We need education funding reform. Thank you.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm so glad to see everybody here. I'm Kathy Nathan, Chair of the Rochester School Board, and I'm an advocate and have always been an advocate for public funds for public education. And I'm so glad to see you all here. I'd like to think that you're already of the converted, but you're going to hear me try to convert you again, and you're going to hear me say that I hope you do something more when you leave here today. We're supposed to advocate for public funding for public schools because we're the adults in charge. And we have the responsibility. In the not too distant future, we're going to ask these students that are here today and that we serve to take over that role. And I would like to make sure, and I think you all share, that we want to make sure they have everything they need to be leaders and collaborators and innovators, and unfortunately to fix the messes that we've left them as adults when we were in charge. So I see this as an investment in their futures. It's the most important investment we can make. We know we're preparing them with knowledge and skills and this important increased focus on social and emotional learning that they're going to need to be resilient and to take us positively in the future. But I'm going to build on funding for public education and talk about adequate and sustainable funding. We came into this conversation this legislative year talking about our special education cross-subsidy, where we take $15 million out of our general fund to fund our mandates for special education services and all the wonderful things that we can do for our special education students. And we've talked about how inflation hasn't funded us adequately in our general formula since 2003, and if it had, we would be getting an additional $17.5 million per year. You also know we're dealing with a $23 million deficit, and we've had to do $14.5 million in cuts to address part of that deficit. And you've heard about the $17 billion surplus and our trifecta and our wonderful local public education-friendly legislators. But I want to tell you that we are not there yet in the proposals that are in the legislature. The governor's budget gives us a 4% and a 2% increase that we've already factored into our projections for the next 2 years, knowing that we are still going to have deficits in future years. So we're not getting the additional funding that the 5% and the 5% would give us that would help us move closer to being having a sustainable budget. The governor's proposal only funds half of the special education cross subsidy. So we're still $7.5 million short in that place. And there's additional legislative proposals that, while a great idea to support our staff and our teachers, are not funded by the state and would require the district to spend additional money in salaries and in benefits that we just currently don't have a funding source to cover. So I would ask you to continue to watch the details from this point on. You'll hear things about omnibus finance bills, and you'll hear things about the negotiations behind the scenes. And I'm sure Isaiah will be sending out action alerts for you to contact your legislators. Contact them once, contact them twice. Send them your personal stories about what this means for your children, your grandchildren, your community stories. Because in addition to the general messages that we want to overwhelm them with, they need to hear about specifically how this impacts people you know or people who you are. Because those are the things that will make them consider and move them in the conversations they're having with each other. And then finally in the debate on the floor, where there will obviously be an overwhelming amount of amendments and efforts to change people's minds. So for those of us who are the adults in the room, for those of us who are responsible for investing in our children's future, the fact that you're here today, the fact that you're willing to be educated, and that you haven't run screaming from the room as we present dollar values in the millions, shows your dedication to our students and our students' future. I'm so grateful to have you all as partners and as supporters of our local district and education in our state, and I look forward to our future conversations.
Up next, we're going to have Jake Johnson. But before we do that, do we want to bring our legislators up here, or do we want to? How about we do that? Sorry, I'm not making this up on the fly. I have this on my clipboard, but I have Carol up here to keep me honest. So, hi, Senator Bolden and Representative Hicks, you want to come on up? That sounds great. And just a reminder, if you guys are hearing, if you're hearing this information and questions are coming up in your mind, Kim is back there in the corner. She does have some index cards. Feel free to jot down some questions after we have Jake and after we do a brief introduction with our legislators. We are going to be doing a Q&A. So please, if you have questions, we have a really great group of people up here who are able to answer those. So, Jake, I'm going to turn this on over to you.
Okay. So I'm going to stand just because I'm more comfortable. I'm a teacher. I teach at Mayo High School this year. And first of all, before I start with my presentation, could we just take for a moment and represent and respect the true heroes in the room, the students who are here on a Saturday learning about school finance. Right? So my name is Jake Johnson. I am a teacher at Mayo High School again. I teach math, but I'm also the incoming, I guess you would say, government relations representative with the Rochester Education Association, which is our local branch of Education Minnesota. So where are we now? I was tasked with sort of just wrapping up a little bit of where we're at in the legislature, just generally, and then maybe paint a picture for you of what Rochester Public Schools could look like with full funding. So there are many bills in the legislature. I looked it up on the House website, and I just typed in education, and there were like 670 some bills right now. So there are a lot of different proposals, and it's very overwhelming. But some of them, just some of the highlights, again, there's a lot, but some of them address class size, right, and trying to lower class size. Some of them pay cross subsidies that were mentioned by some of our experts earlier. Some support community schools. John Marshall High School is an example of a full-service community school. There are others in Rochester as well. Trying to address teacher recruitment and retention, right? Like, we have a really hard time hanging on to teachers. So there are things like pension reform to try to get teacher pensions on par with things like police officers, highway patrolmen, nurses, so that we're on a level playing field. Trying to recruit more teachers of color so that the teachers who stand in front of our students look more like they do. More mental health support professionals, because we know, as Sherry was talking earlier, there are increased demands on our students that we've really never seen before, and we're seeing a lot of that from COVID, and now it's just sort of coming to fruition. So where are we going next? The governor's proposed a budget target of $2.2 billion. So what does that mean? Well, it's not decided where that will go, right? So there are various legislative committees that will determine where that $2.2 billion were to go. And could it change? Yes. Do we know where it goes? Not yet. But that's hopefully why you're here, is to help inform our legislators that our kids need the money, and it's not necessarily a luxury, as Principal Ruzick was saying. It's just trying to meet the basic needs of our kids. Okay? It could be allocated in different ways. Some is the per pupil formula, so money that goes with the kids. Some is tied to certain programs. You know, you've maybe heard Science of Reading is kind of out there in the media right now. There are other programs and initiatives that it could fund, and it's supposed to be done, my understanding, by the end of May-ish, okay? So we will know. So this is a key window where if education advocates, people who care about what's best for our students, can speak up and let the legislators know that this is very important to us, that this is the heartbeat of our community, that we can make a difference in the lives of not just current students, but future students as well. Okay? So, $2.2 billion, that's a lot. That's a lot of money. This is from the North Star Policy Action Institute. Someone at Education Minnesota recommended it to me, and I mean, wow, a wealth of resources. This was broken down just for Rochester, so let me explain what this looks like. This goes back to 2003, back to $2003 and adjusts for inflation. And when you look at this graph, you can see state aid that's up there in yellow. Well, that's not great, right? That's not great. We're not back to 2003 levels of funding, according to this source. And as Dr. Piquel said, most of our money does come from the state. So we've tried in Rochester to make up the gap. Let's see if I can use this fancy, yeah. This is us. This is us in red, right? This is what we ask our local taxpayers to fund. Some people are like, man, my property taxes keep going up in Rochester. Well, that's because of this. We're trying to fill in this gap. Because in blue, that's the revenue. That's the money we have coming into our system. And there was one good year there, I guess, that one. But overall, we've been digging out of a hole for a long time. So $2.2 billion is just a start, as Director Nathan said. $2.2 billion is a start to get us back to where we need to be so that our students can get what they deserve. Okay. There are other proposals out there as well, though. So if you think education funding, there are other ideas. One of them, a big one that's in the news a lot, is this idea of a Social Security tax exemption. Sounds pretty good. Just don't count Social Security as income. Just exempt it so that people don't have to pay taxes on it. Well, that's one way to spend it. If a full Social Security tax exemption, that is allowing all Social Security to count not as income, right, that would spend over 20% of the ongoing budget surplus, with that number only growing with time. It's an idea that primarily benefits the rich in our society. As a matter of fact, seniors who only rely on Social Security for income would receive essentially no benefit from this action. Okay, so think of our poorest seniors who maybe only rely on Social Security. that exemption is essentially nothing for them. And the trade-off is going to be massive. As a matter of fact, 70% of the cost to taxpayers would go to the top 20% of retirees. Essentially, a tax cut for the rich. So who does it benefit? Well, if you make, in retirement, if you make over $250,000 a year, you are seeing the biggest benefit from that. So Education Minnesota and Isaiah Minnesota are both largely opposed to this action, and we would prefer that money is spent on things that actually help working people. So the question is, and the question I have for you is pretty simple. What kind of community do we want to live in? You've heard various experts here today involved in schools in a variety of capacities lay out for you what a world-class education can look like in Rochester, Minnesota. There are other viewpoints on what we should do with our money. Give it back to rich people in retirement. But I've got 4 boys in the school system. I'm a teacher in Rochester Public Schools and have been for 17 years. And I can tell you the kind of community I want to live in. It's one where there is a media specialist for all of my boys to help them figure out exactly what the truth is out there in the scary world of the internet. Right? And it's a system where great principals like Mr. Ruzick don't have to weigh which of these fantastic programs needs to go away, right? It's a system where teachers can retire with dignity and be treated like professionals, and it's a system where our students, like Sherry said, a system where our students with complex needs are all having them met. We have fantastic students in our system. We have AP students who are going off to 4-year colleges and are going to design the next technology that we don't even know exists yet. And we've got students who join us in kindergarten who've never picked up a book. So what are we going to do for those students? What are we going to tell those students? Do we believe in you or don't we? As a community, do we believe in you or do we not? That's a pretty dark thing to tell a kindergarten. Well, sorry guys, your parents should have read to you. That's not the kind of community I want to live in. And I don't think it's the community most Minnesotans want to live in. But we have to do something about it. And that thing that we have to do is make our voice heard to the people who can make the decisions. And for school funding, we've heard it over and over again, it is the legislature and the governor in Minnesota. That's how we're funded. So you've got to make your voices heard. There's a lot, there's 600 bills. What do I do? You're here, so that's a good start, right? You're showing our legislators that it matters to you. You are here, that's a start. Keep talking about education. Don't let it fall to the wayside. Keep it on the forefront of their minds, because there's a lot of people that have a lot of needs, and I get it. But education at its core is an investment in who we are now and who we will be in the future, okay? So, thank you. That's my time. Thanks a lot.
I don't know how I can follow that. Woo! All right. So what we're going to do, thank you both. You guys have been so busy, and I am grateful. Thank you very much to Senator Bolden and Representative Hicks for being with us today. I want you guys to introduce yourselves and just kind of give a brief background. Again, I know both of you have kids, have had kids that are in our public schools, so I know that this is something that is near and dear to both of you. And then after our representatives introduce themselves, I'm going to ask some of our subject matter experts to come back on up, and we're going to start that Q&A. So again, if you do have questions, there is Kim back there. Go ahead and ask them, and we'll be rolling into that shortly. So Kim, I'm going to hand you my microphone.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I am Representative Kim Hicks, so I represent the northwest and northeast part of Rochester. That's not the bullseye. So kind of wrapping around into Orinoco and Haverhill Township. I have 5 permanent kids and 3 on the way to join our family, so all of which are public school kiddos. So I have touched pretty much a large chunk of Rochester Public Schools at this point. I think we've been in quite a few of them. And we are Rockets, so. And actually this weekend we're painting a room black and red. Anyway, I am very committed to educational funding. And as everyone here has talked about, there are a lot of competing demands. But I want to kind of ground us in the fact that the Education Finance Committee got the largest target. It got more money than Human Services. It got more money than any other target. And so I'm not on the Education Committee, but that spoke very highly to me about where priorities are. The largest target. I'm going to let that sink in for just a second. And the largest target ever. The biggest investment in the history of Minnesota. However, it wasn't as much as we asked for. And what that means is that we are going to have to make choices. And those choices need to be student-based. And so I am really looking forward to hearing which of those 600 bills make it into the big package. I have advocated for a really long time for the special education cross-subsidy. That is an issue near and dear to my heart for a variety of reasons, many of them being I'm sorry to all of my children's special ed teachers. But there's another piece of that that I don't talk about publicly very often, but I'm just going to do it real quick in 30 seconds, I promise. Is that when we aren't fully funding special education and we are forcing our districts to pull the money to do what we mandate them to do, and that they should do, and they know how I feel about the should part of that, then what we do is we create us and them. And when we create us and them amongst people with disabilities, we limit inclusion. And inclusion is important, but we can't do inclusion without funding. So just so everybody knows, that's one piece that I am really advocating for in every space I can be in, because it links to all of our other pieces. And I just continue to push that piece as well. So thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Senator Liz Bolden. I represent District 25, which is most of Rochester and then up north, Orinoco, Haverhill Township area as well. I just thank you for holding this today. Thank you for those who organized. Thank you to those of you who are here. Clearly, our community values education, as evidenced by a room full of folks on a Saturday morning when it's nice outside. And so thank you for being here. Can I just quickly, show of hands for all the students who are here. If you're a student, raise your hand. That's amazing. Thank you to you all. And now raise your hand, show of hands for educators, if you're a teacher, educator. Amazing, thank you. So we are really grateful to have engaged community members who are advocating for this. And so this is my first term in the Senate, but prior to this, I served one term in the House. I'm a mom of 3. All 3 of my kiddos graduated from John Marshall. So we are Rockets as well. And education is really important to me. My background outside of the legislature is that I'm a nurse. I've been a nurse for over 20 years, but I'm also an educator. I have a master's degree in nursing education, and so education, certainly that's different than what you all do, but education is important to me, and it is important to us as a state, as evidenced by the resources, the budget target, as we call it, that has been identified. And I appreciate sort of the laying of the groundwork of sort of where we are at in the legislative session, and there's a lot happening in St. Paul this year, and so it is, if you're not really, paying attention closely or in it every day, it is hard to keep track of. And so appreciate forums like this where we can just talk about and share about what is happening and what's going on. And so the point in the process we are at right now, as has been described, is that budget targets have been identified, which I'll just put in a plug for having that occur in mid-March is also historic. Typically that happens a couple of weeks before the end of session in May. And so and to have agreement between the House and the Senate and the governor's office, we are all in agreement on those targets. It really, that is an outlier from what happens historically. So we are in a good place with that. And so with that agreement of the education budget target being $2.1 billion, billion with a B, is a historic investment and a necessary investment in our education system, which I also would be remiss if I didn't say has been underfunded for decades. So we have a lot of making up, work to do. And so, can we, with this $2.1 billion, can we do everything that we need to do? The reality is no, but we can certainly get farther down along that path, and we can make investments that our kids need, that educators need. So I look forward to chatting more about what that looks like. Again, that package, that what we call the omnibus bill for education, is being built right now, like literally today and this week. Those conversations are happening. And I also don't sit on the Education Finance Committee. I sit on Education Policy. But those decisions are being made right now to build that package of the budget that we will pass off the floor and pass into law. So look forward to more conversations about what is needed and what that will look like. So thank you.
All right, I'm going to invite some of Dr. Piquel, anybody up here, Kathy Nathan, who just kind of is that subject matter expert, because I got a handful of fantastic questions up here that I would love for our people to be able to. Thank you. Thank you. I was just say, Jake, I don't know if you want to head back up or. Excellent. All right, and then just a note. Okay, so right now, just a time check, we are at noon. So again, thank you guys for being here today. What a wonderful crowd. I have a great amount of questions here. I am going to try to get through all of them. No guarantees, but know that if you have asked a question, I will make sure to pass it on to somebody so they can know what your question is. I don't know what a vehicle would be that we would be able to get it answered, but there's a lot of good questions in here, and thank you guys for your time and your thoughtfulness. So I am gonna start with, I'm just gonna start at the top of the list here. The state took over funding of our schools, but did so at 85%. Does full funding mean 100% of funding comes from the state? So then, local property tax referendum would be extra. Who would be a good person to answer that? Is that Dr. Piquel? Would that be you, or?
The question is actually illustrative of something that is very important, which is that in Minnesota we have never defined funding adequacy. There have been a couple efforts to do it, most prominently during the Pawlenty era, but it happened again under Governor Dayton. In every instance, as the committee started to get close to actually saying what it costs to meet state standards, to be honest, administrations dropped the effort because they said this is going to break the bank. So we do not have, as a state, a definition of what an adequate funding model would be. So we're left trying to divide up the dollars the best we can. There would never be a sort of clouds part perfect solution that everyone suddenly says, you know, hallelujah, this is it. But we don't actually have that standard for what it would take. Other states, and especially other leading countries, have done that. They've defined that. So we don't have a what would quote unquote full funding be. The place of local levies in Minnesota is a really important policy issue. It is an opportunity on one hand for a local community to invest in its kids. When we look at the degree to which Rochester residents invest in our students, we are incredibly grateful for that support. It is nowhere near the top of the state in terms of local levies. I believe a community this education interested could be motivated to increase its investment in its kids with really solid strategies, and I think, as Matt was saying, the promise that you're watching the bottom line and being very efficient. And so if the premise of the question is, if the state funded more, could we get rid of local levies? That would be an important decision. That would also take from us in Rochester the opportunity to invest more in our kids. What we don't want is what is usually the case now, which is the local levy is, rather than investing more in your kids, it's filling gaps. And it is not a coincidence that our combined shortfall in mandatory services, which we are pleased to provide for our students with disabilities and multi-language learners, of $15 million for special education funding and $3.5 million for ELL, is shockingly almost the same amount as the structural deficit that we're trying to close. So were those things fully funded, we might be able to see the local levy as additive rather than replacing underfunded requirements. So that was a very wonky answer, but that's what you get if you ask me. So,
Senator Bolden, did you have anything to add to that, or all right? Okay. Well, so I'm the next question, and this is a good one that I know has been on top of my mind, is there are some wonderful bills that are that we're hearing about coming out of St. Paul, including paid family medical leave, increased minimum salaries, et cetera, that are being proposed. So even with that increased funding that we are hopefully going to get from the state this year, how will school districts manage these increased costs?
So I think the important thing here is not to focus on the individual components, but to talk about how we're going to put together a package. And everybody in here has done a household budget, right? You've done your budget, you know what you gotta pay for your mortgage, you know what your heat is, you know what your electric is, you would guess on your groceries, right? Got your car payment. And you have to make all of the pieces of that budget fit together. And that's what the Education Committee is working on this weekend. And there are going to be pieces of that that are going to come out of different bills and are going to be some of those portions. And then there's going to be pieces that are going to be part of the local responsibility. And to be clear, we don't just do that in education, we also do that in human services, right? Like disability services has this Medicaid funding, which is federal, and it has state dollars, and we allot state dollars, and then counties also have a share, right? Like Minnesota operates that way. And it's for the reason that was shared in that local communities know their communities and have a say. There's going to be hard decisions to be made. But when we're making those hard decisions, I think it's important that we remember that educators are people and employees and deserve the same rights and benefits as everyone else. And if we're going to ask businesses to do the right thing for their employees, and we're asking businesses that also rely exclusively on state funding, like disability services as well, to do the right thing, we're going to have to ask everyone to do the right thing. And so it's a puzzle piece. We're going to put the puzzle together. And I think the end puzzle, because we have the largest target in history for education, will work. But it does mean that all 600 of those bills aren't going to get into the puzzle. And so I think it's important that we just recognize that. And I'm going to do like a quick paid family medical leave rant, and then I will stop. Paid family medical leave is 35 cents for every $100 in wages up to the cap of I think it's $61,000 a year. After somebody earns $61,000 a year, they don't pay more for the percentage of paid family medical leave. It is 35 cents for every $100. And so I challenge people who come at me and say the cost of paid family medical leave to employers, regardless of who that employer is. If your child's third grade teacher had cancer, do you think that the 35 cents for every $100 is worth their ability to get chemo? I do. And I think it's worth it for every employee in the state of Minnesota, period.
Thank you. So I got my own microphone, so you can hold that one, Principal Ruzek. Thank you. Kent or Kathy, can you guys talk about that local component as we're thinking about some of these mandates that might be coming down from the state? Again, there's even with increased funding, how will school districts manage these increased costs? I know this has been a conversation that our school board and our administration have been having.
Yeah, I'll be brief and I'll let my boss say what is on her mind. Just to take the point that we just, I think powerfully, Kim was addressing family and medical leave. For Rochester, that'd be about 1.1 million of an additional responsibility. Half would be funded, half would fall to us. So that would be a new $500,000 expense for our district. As I mentioned in my comments at the outset, there's stuff beyond what happens in K-12 schools that matters tremendously to the well-being of our kids. Families being able to be supported through that cancer diagnosis not only matters to the kids of those families, but creates humane and caring school cultures. But it is a cost that we have to look at, and we heard earlier about the very difficult decision of reductions in high school media specialists. That cost is much more than that. I actually personally really empathize with that requirement, and I think you framed it quite persuasively in that there's a local piece of addressing a bigger picture. But as you say, that points out the hard decisions that we grapple with as we would be looking at another $500,000 in an expense for Rochester Public Schools to meet our commitment there. And so that's the tension that is there. As you said, it's a puzzle piece, and we have to, at the local level, make those decisions, and then at the national level as well.
And I think I'd only add that it's part of the ongoing educational piece for our community that we've talked about as a board and with the superintendent that we have to continue to do. Because, as we've said, as the numbers are coming in now, when you compare them to some of the new requirements, they're still not adding up. So this perception of the surplus is in a lot of people's heads that, well, it's gonna cover everything. We're gonna be fine. And we've been projecting our structural deficits for a few years now. We first talked about it, 3 years ago. So we knew it was coming because of the chronic underfunding of education from the state. So we're not going to be at 0 point, as Kim has said. We're not going to get to a point where we can breathe easily, and we won't be talking about budget cuts, and we won't be talking about additional funding from our local taxpayers. So know that as you're advocating to your legislators and as you're talking to your neighbors, because it's not just the piece about talking to the legislators. It could be a conversation we're going to have as a community in the near future to talk to the community about the structure of our funding and why we might be coming to the community to ask them for additional revenues. So it forces an ongoing conversation.
Excellent, thank you for that. So again, we're talking about funding, and we're seeing good things that are happening in our state's capital, and one of those is the recent bill that was passed and signed into law providing school lunches. And so this is a specific kind of a policy wonk question that is going towards probably Dr. Pickell and Kathy. What will happen with the
compensatory funding now that families will no longer need to apply for free or reduced price meals?
It's a great question. We're held harmless for next year, meaning it's not going to be reduced, which we very much appreciated. We don't know what the implications will be longer term. Measuring poverty by asking a parent to fill out a very complex form has always been a bad way to measure poverty, and there are emerging some better ways to do it. I think the issue of free breakfast and lunch for all is one in which I would argue we should actually try it and see what happens, which sounds kind of like obvious, but very often we consider these things almost from an ideological perspective. Good, bad. What I wish had been included in the full funding, which is fully funded, thank you, for school lunches, was a modest but sufficient evaluation to see if we improve hunger, or if we improve classroom attention, or if we improve attendance. Because all of those things are hypothesized to come from this. And as we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars, which I think on balance is probably a good idea, it does, Jake gave a really powerful statement about the Social Security stuff, which is beyond my job responsibilities. So, but it's what we call regressive. It's taking dollars at a time of scarcity and spending them on people who might not need it. We may have done that, we collectively, with school lunches. We're going to buy lunches for families that could have paid, but there's some reason to believe we're going to get a lot of those kids who are hungry, and we're going to get more of them well fed by our fabulous nutrition services people in Rochester. But we ought to watch it and see. We actually ought to see, because I think for those of us who want to see scarce dollars go where the need is greatest, 3 or 5 years from now, we should be able to step back and look and say, did that additional investment enhance student nutrition, enhance, classroom performance, which we all know is influenced by if you're hungry or not.
The other piece that I want to talk about with that is that there are some bills working through to try to solve that problem moving forward, and I'm hopeful that they will be included in the puzzle piece. And the other piece that I don't think we talk about is, free and reduced lunch. Family of 4 is $50,000. $50,000 is free and reduced lunch. I know for lots of families that are over $50,000, maybe they're 2 parents that both make $20 an hour. That's an $80,000 family of 4. School lunch is $2.24 for lunch and $2.25 $1.95 for breakfast. I personally write a check for $100 for each child every 6 weeks. You're welcome. Really appreciate that. But if you are an $80,000 family, then that means $200 out of your budget every month when you're only bringing in $3,000 after you pay your car, your health insurance and your taxes and all of your things, and your rent in a 2-bedroom apartment in Rochester is now up to $1,200 a month, right? So free and reduced or universal meals isn't just talking about helping the kids that would have already qualified for free and reduced meals. It's talking about helping the middle class kids and the lower middle class kids whose families are finding themselves incredibly struggling every single day. And this narrative that there are all kinds of families that have an extra $200 a month to pay for their kids' lunches is completely not accurate unless you are in the top 30% of income, period. So that's the other part that doesn't come up a lot when we're talking about it. And I just want to talk about those middle class families who are really, really struggling, but they don't make the cutoff for the supports. So.
Excellent, thank you for that. So I have 3 questions that I'm going to combine into one here, and so forgive me. I know that sometimes, and these are all very good questions, but they all have to do with foreign language. So, so legislators, you get to stand down unless you have really strong opinions about those things. I'm really bad at language, so I don't. But anyway, how would budget increases affect the high school language classes that have gone into a hybrid format? And related to that, there is a lot of languages have been put into an online format other than Spanish. How high of a priority is it for the school district to bring these languages back in person or increase the number of teachers? So this is specific to, I guess, Spanish teachers. Kids who want to take Spanish cannot because of limited class spots. And then to, again, there have been some talk about dismissing teachers this next year. I am concerned about losing Spanish class in middle school. Do we have any chance to keep this in the 2023-24 year?
It's probably me, unavoidably. We are making no reductions in high school world language. That is entirely driven by enrollment. Those are elective classes, and the classes that kids choose to take determine our ability to maintain those. Going to online in French, German, and Latin last year was a very reluctant decision. I know for most kids it's not the ideal learning environment. I'm actually passionate about world language, studied it myself in high school and in college. Parenthetically, my mom was also a high school media specialist, so all of these cuts are personally difficult in many ways. There's no reduction in world language at the high school level except as adjusted by enrollment, and if there are more kids that want to take Spanish, as we always do, we would increase that. The other languages we offer are German, French, and Latin. They are taught by superb educators. We also need to make sure we are meeting the needs of our kids. We've just done a survey of our high school students, and by far the most popular languages they've expressed are Spanish, Chinese, and Arabic. We do not offer Chinese or Arabic. Now that we have a working group that is beginning to develop a long-term world language strategy. At the middle school level, we have offered what's called an exploratory course in Spanish that all kids are taking. It's relatively brief, and we have recommended eliminating that class for next year. The vast majority of those students did not go on to study Spanish in high school. And all I can say about that is that's a budget cut. That's not a reform. That's not something I would have walked in and said, let's cut Spanish at the middle school level. And sometimes I have to restrain myself from trying to find reasons I think that's good. It's a less worse option than reducing some of the other things we might need to reduce. Candidly, it hasn't been a discussion for us just yet, but we do need to, next fall or the following fall, go back to the citizens of Rochester and ask them to, at minimum, renew an operating referendum, unless the legislature passes legislation that says school boards don't need to do that. If we do that and we cannot point to specific things we had to cut, I think for the average voter out there, 80% of whom do not have kids in our school district, they're not going to actually get the urgency of this unless we can say we had to cut this, 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 and this. That would be a this that I would be talking about should the board vote to put a referendum on the ballot of something that we never would have cut except for the financial position that we're in.
Thank you. And Carol, I see you. Thank you. Everybody, Carol Schaefer, she's keeping me on time up here. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, so we have, okay, now I got to find it. You guys, you asked wonderful questions. I can tell that you are interested and passionate about education. Thank you very much. That was a high school question, so I'm going to ask, I guess, my final question. And again, sorry, there are so many good questions here. This one is more aimed towards elementary, and that is, does the district have enough reading specialists for K through 5 so that all students can read at grade level by the time they go to our middle schools? I'm going to put you on the hot seat there.
Yeah, I know time's limited. We are developing a comprehensive literacy plan. Jake mentioned the science of reading. It's a dramatic change in how some aspects of reading have been taught in the last 20 years. There is legislation that's pending that could be very helpful to us. The way we staff and support reading is something that will be fundamentally addressed through that plan. Reading specialists are one source of support. We have maintained them at current levels in our budget reduction strategy, so we're not going backwards. Whether we have enough needs to actually be answered as part of a comprehensive strategy around literacy. And so I would not focus on that one source of support, because then there's also the classroom teacher, K-5, who is not necessarily a reading specialist, but who is the first deliverer. And candidly, we have some gaps in our curriculum that we have to fill, and that are going to be filled in the next year. We've made a lot of progress in K through 2, and we have some significant gaps in 3 to 5 that we're going to be filling. So if you said to me, Kent, what's more important, this position or getting a high-quality reading curriculum in the upper elementary grades, I'd have to be able to make that choice between what's really going to move us forward at this time as a system. But we're going to have a comprehensive strategy for reading in our elementary schools and supports in our middle schools and high schools for kids who are struggling readers.
Hi, Bridget again. One thing just to kind of piggyback off that is when I spoke earlier, I talked about access, and that's a great question, is how do we support reading in the early years? But in reality, at the secondary level, we get students from out of district and out of state. And so part of that funding need is to have those reading supports for students who will not have gone through our excellent reading program in the elementary, so that we can provide them the supports to catch up in those later educational years.
Thank you.
One other piece, I think, and Dr. Pickell had referenced this as well, but a comprehensive plan, not just around reading instruction or curriculum, but we're looking at 600 bills. Jake had referenced the 600 bills. Community schools is requesting 90 million. Community schools oftentimes bounces back between and forth health and human services and education finance. The fact of the matter is you get a return on your dollar because it's addressing things like affordable child care, and it's looking at access to information for parents, not just our students in our schools. And if you go down the wormhole of affordable daycare and then access to preschool, Bridget just referenced high school students coming to us with limited access to this quality. We have kindergarten students who are reading the 7th Harry Potter on the first day of school, and then we have other students who can't recognize a single letter in their first name. So that gap is present by the time they're 5. So we need to have funding that addresses before they ever get to K-12, and I think that part of the 600 bills is part of that as well. So.
All right. Well, again, thank you. We weren't able to get to every question. Know that they were very good. I'm going to pass these on to some of our experts up here. So, again, they know what your guys' concerns are as community members. And now I'm going to turn it over to my timekeeper and colleague here.
Thank you. And let's start by thanking all our panelists with a wonderful round of applause. We also want to thank Christ United Methodist Church for their hospitality, especially Pastors Kirkland Reynolds and Jenny Cannon, the church staff, and the congregation. Thank you. I want to thank our child care workers and our planning team. Volunteers Amy Hokrafer, Ann Marie Griffin, Jake Johnson, Kim Harris, Shelley Mahana, Isaiah organizer Olivia Bergen, and me, Carol Schaefer. And most of all, we thank all of you for coming and participating today. Give yourselves a round of applause. So now the time comes to take the next steps and move from learning into action. I believe in all our nation's ideals, and they're summarized at the end of the Pledge of Allegiance: liberty and justice for all. I believe that quality public education is one means by which our nation strives for our ideals, by offering each and every young person the opportunity to learn, grow, and develop their potential. You all know, we all know, there is a movement in this country to gut funding for public education in order to weaken and maybe even destroy it. There's a movement in this country to get back to the original values of our founding fathers, which translates to white patriarchal rule, predominantly rich, white, heterosexual men in power. So we who believe in liberty and justice for all have to work. We have to work for economic, racial, gender, and climate justice in all kinds of ways. No act is too small, and no opposition is insurmountable. I love Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, I believe unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word. So I myself was mobilized to act when a group of people who opposed quality public education for all disrupted a school board meeting in July of 2021. As a woman in my 60s, I know that public education is important and vital for our present and our future. For the families who have kids in it, of course, but for our community, our state, and our nation. I know each of you have your own reasons for being here today. So a show of hands, how many of you are willing to contact your legislators, state legislators, about funding? Thank you, thank you, thank you. And there's even a QR code on the commitment form, so you can click on that if you don't want to write your own letter. Please do it. Yes. Yes. Couldn't students write to their legislators?
Yes, please do.
Yes, yes. Students can contact your legislators. Yes. Thank you, Becky. Great question. Also, how many of you are willing to learn more about the need for public referendum for our school district in the coming years? Yay, great. Check that box on your form too, and students, you're welcome to check that box on your form too. I don't have my form in front of me. Thank you, Jack. So please take a moment to fill out these forms and hand them to, take a picture of it after you fill it out, and then hand it to people at the doors. Kim is back at one door, and Olivia's at another door, and Anne Marie will help pick them up so that we can collate this information. We can get people interested in learning more about a levy on the school district to the school district people. And please, please do it. Take an action. When you take the first action, it might be scary. The second action's a little less scary. And then it gets to be energizing to do it. So thank you for coming today, and thank you all. One more round of applause for everybody. Thanks, Jack. Oh my gosh, 12:28, whoa. Oh, with that extra minute, I'll invite you all to a rally for Caring for Minnesota, which is April 29th. I'll invite you all to a rally for Caring for Minnesota, which will address several issues like housing, paid family and medical leave, a moral budget, child care funding. This will be held at Martin Luther King Jr. Park on Saturday, April 29th, 2 to 4 in the afternoon. We hope to see you there. Thank you.
And I'm like, oh my God, we started late, we're still on time.
Isn't that great? Yeah, everybody did a good job.